Logging is critical to helping you figure out what is wrong inside your application, if anything ever goes wrong, and scopes can help you augment your logs to better understand what's going on. Let's mash on that.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at logging scopes.
Yes, we are. So, here's the thing about logging. It can be very verbose, and it can add a lot of information. Simon, the project that you and I work on, we actually are logging currently over 60 gigs of logs per month. So
It's true, and our application doesn't really do anything. Well, I mean, except generate logs.
it is a log generation application, yeah.
Yeah.
So success. However, when you're sifting through those logs, sometimes isolating information about what is happening in a particular context can be difficult, and that's where we want to include something, or we might want to augment something called scopes. Now, where this really comes into play is you can imagine where something enters your application, or request enters the pipeline, and we have a whole number of services that are in play. And during the lifetime of a request, we might be going off and executing some task over here, and then you can imagine your call chain where you kind of enter almost like the Russian doll kind of thing, right? Like you start going deeper into your call chain, and then you come back out eventually. And so as you go deeper, sometimes you come out partway and then you go back in, and while you're doing this, you might not understand where all of these different things are happening, or where this problem might be happening inside of your logs. And so what you can do is you can instruct the framework to open a scope for you and say, I am now beginning the process of purchasing a ski card pass for a customer. And then everything that's going to happen inside of that scope, everything that's going to happen for the rest of the time, as long as that scope stays open, will happen with that information. We can adorn additional scopes. We can nest them inside of each other at any point in the call chain. Now, there's recommendation. I haven't seen why they've recommended this other than for kind of maintaining clarity. But the recommendation seems to be to not do it so much, only when it's really adding value. And that's probably true anytime we're logging. So when you feel that you're at a critical business application or part of your application, and inside of this functionality, you want to make sure that you understand what is happening, that's where we're going to introduce scopes. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, I'm just going to request the home page. And now I'll show you how to turn this on really quickly. So I'm just going to look at my app settings.json, and we've seen this before where we've got the log level, and we say our default log level is debug, and then everything else we want logged out for system and Microsoft to be at the information level. This means that for log level debug or higher, the default in our system, any namespaces that aren't explicitly matched here, the default will be, if it's debug or higher, it's going to be logging out for us. And for system and Microsoft, it'll be information level or higher. In production, you're probably going to change those, especially for system and Microsoft. You might want to change those out to an error level, so that you don't need to know that a connection is being established to SQL Server, maybe, because if something fails in that process, you're going to get an error message, and so that would be enough. But up at the top of this, so that's the log level stuff, and I can't recall if we've actually talked about it on the show about log levels before, but there's some interesting things that we can talk about there as well. However, include scopes is set to false. Now, I happen to actually go in and change my user secrets. And remember that configuration, we've talked about this a number of times on the show already, that you can actually use user secrets to override any of your app settings in the development environment. So one of the user secrets that I've added in is I've added it under this logging node is include scopes is true. So when my application starts up, we get the logging section, including that little tag to include the scopes. And here's that logging config that we pull out. So we get that iConfiguration out of the iConfiguration section out of this get section, and then we pass that into console to add console. Add console has this overload that accepts an iConfiguration section and then checks for some known keys. One of which is add scopes. Okay, so I'm talking about this. I haven't actually shown you what is going to happen. So here we are. The app is running, and I'm going to request the About page. And this will eventually surface up. I'm not really too concerned about that because I've already got enough to show you over here. What's happened is that it starts revealing the scope information inside of our logs. So there's this little almost lambda looking kind of indicator that's added here. And it shows the scope. So the scope is the request ID and the request path. But then it also shows that we've entered an additional scope that was created for us on behalf of the framework for Alpine Ski House Controller's home controller about. So we're 2 levels deep into the scope here, and it's telling us what's going on. Now, were I to actually do any logging at that point, that would show me that I was inside of that scope. And here on the console, maybe it's not the easiest thing to identify, and just having a scope by name of an action or having a scope by the name of a class might not give you enough information to help debug. So let's take this one step further. And to show you, like insofar as how this goes, I'll just go back to home. And I threw a couple of extra things in here, just I just threw a warning in here that I made up that the client secret key wasn't long enough or whatever. But in here you see that this is happening inside of this request ID, and it's happening inside of this action on this controller. So if I pop back over to my home controller, we can see that indeed there's just this random warning that I've added in here, logger.log warning. But now from the log file, that has now been augmented with scope information. What's cool about this is if you have a look at the scope, at the root of this where the request is starting, we can see up here, there's actually quite a bit going on for this. So, it's the NO, right. So in this particular case, I could actually search for this string in my logs and find all, and this is pretty easy because it's one user on one website, right? On one service. So if you could imagine when you're looking at your logs and you've got 1,000 simultaneous users on your website, and you're sifting through all of these different requests and all these different logs, you might have things that are interwoven over a series of over a matter of seconds. But again, with sheer volume, the logs might be intersecting with other things. You want to filter things out for just this request, and now we've got that ability. Or maybe I'm only interested in the scope at this index level, so I can actually search for these scope properties, where it's this request ID for this request path, those kinds of things. So we want to augment, though, with something more meaningful, because maybe we've got something like a user ID to key off of. So I will go over here and I will go to the ski card controller and I will create a new ski card. And I'll show you what I've done in the code here as well. I have basically asked the logger. So we've used dependency injection to inject a logger for us. So we request an iLogger of type ski card controller, and the logger factory, there's an abstraction over all of the logging framework bits that we're using underneath. You could be using Serolog or Log4Net or whatever the case may be, but there's an abstraction that has a logger factory that will produce a logger of this type, the iSki card controller. And in this particular case, I save it to a field here on the class. But then in the create method, what I do when I go to do the interesting thing to the business is I begin a scope saying create ski card for this user ID. Okay, so we'll watch the logs and I'll go back into the site and I will say for some random person, we'll make up a birth date for them. Okay, and we'll say create ski card. We've got a whole bunch of other interesting information going on here. And what I want to point out is that, first and foremost, we have this scope wrapping a call to entity framework, right? So this is actually something that's happening outside of our method, but inside of our scope. So this is somewhere else, but inside our logs, what we can actually see is, let me just make sure I can isolate it here. So we've got a request ID. Let me just look for that one with the user ID in it. It's going to be up here a little bit. So there's the created successfully. Here we go. Created successfully and ski card created. So here's this create ski card scope that I created. So we're entering into it up here. And then for the duration of everything inside of that entire block of code, everything will be inside of that scope. Now I can query my logs for create ski card with this GUID, and this will come back and show me everything that happened in the call chain for the entire time that scope was active. Again, this is a pretty simple kind of a fairly tight example of this, and there's only really the external call to EF, but you could imagine when you've got services that call services that call services, or internal or otherwise, that are doing their own logging for whatever you've got configured for by logging level. This allows us to maintain a view over everything that happens inside of that scope. So that was a little gem that I found that I thought that would be great to share and understand when you're building out your logs.
So cool. that configuration setting where you set the scoped logging, that creates like an implicit scope around every request?
Yeah, so the implicit scope happens anyways, but you can create additional scopes. Include scopes just is something that will expose it to the logger so that it will it sees it. It just makes it visible to whatever's logging.
And this scope, like inside of the log file here, it looks to me like this stuff is on separate lines. Is that accurate, or is that just a bunch of spaces that are in there?
Yeah, so the way that logging happens for the console logger, this is all one log statement, and I can tell that because there's an info prefix and then everything is indented afterwards. I'll pull out one that makes it's a little bit easier to see, and we'll throw it into into a notepad here.
Well, I guess my question is just that it looks to me like we've got this one long line, or this thing is multiple lines basically. So is there some sort of protection in place to stop this from being interwoven with another statement that's also can become multiple lines?
Yeah, so internally in the logging framework, there's actually a lock that's put over top of this as it's writing. So this will all be preserved so this all comes across on one line. Everything, the scope comes across on one line, and you can separate it by that token. And I don't know what would happen if some of your text ended up having that same token, and it would probably be hard to interpret. But if you were looking for specifics, I can now either search by the outermost scope or the innermost scope or anything in between, and I'd be able to find everything related to it.
So is this a requirement, like if I'm writing my own log sync, that it needs to be capable of receiving like multiple lines at once as a single log statement?
Like if you're implementing your own logger, that's I don't think so. I believe that this is actually passed over as part of the category information in the log that comes to you.
Okay, so it's just the way this console log works. Is basically like we're not actually logging that information out. That's just metadata of the log statement itself, and the way the console logger writes it is that it writes it kind of before it writes the actual statement.
Right, it chooses to write it in that way. That's right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense then.
Now these scopes are limited to the current request, right? Like if you were trying to track some sort of business process that spanned multiple requests, this wouldn't necessarily solve that problem, would it?
No, it wouldn't. However, if you wanted to, I suppose you could re-enter a scope. So if you wanted to create a some kind of ID, like a correlation ID that you wanted to use from request to request,
right,
and your application was otherwise aware of it, you would be able to enter a scope for each of those that spanned multiple requests, and then at least have that tagged into your log file as well.
Okay. Very cool.
But you're right. The request is the implicit scope is your request information at the root of the request, and so that has this guy right here, and that's what's locked in.
Great. I think that's really useful. I would use
Definitely
that if I was on a project that had support for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the scopes are definitely something of interest to look at for future development.
Well, that's great. Thanks, James, and thanks everyone for joining us again here on the ASP.NET Monsters. Remember to like, comment, share, and send us an email with your comments and questions, just like these folks.
Okay, so today's question comes from Yanni, and who asks, "What would a monsters? I guess what would a monsters convention be?" Now, this comes on episode 68. We were talking about custom conventions for ASP.NET. So thank you very much for the question. What would a monsters convention look like?
See, I was thinking of like the other definition of convention there. It's like a bunch of monsters hanging out, maybe going to some sessions, how to scare, how to eat kids, that sort of thing.
Yeah, chewing techniques for
Yeah.
kids of different heights and
Yeah, they'd have like
maybe
ridiculous clickbait titles for people coming to their sessions. Like, I ate 6 kids. You won't believe what happened on number 7.
I think the thing too is that it's worth pointing out is that monsters conventions are very expensive to attend.
This is true.
Yeah.
All right, but this was a convention for creating stuff inside of ASP.NET, right?
That's right. So inside of ASP.NET, we have the ability to there's a default set of conventions, as we talked about in episode 68, that kind of assume that all of the things kind of fall into place. It lets us do away with most of the configuration and just say that if a controller is named this, then there'll be a view in this place that you can tie into an action of the same name and things like that. And a convention, a custom convention in ASP.NET Core MVC allows us to say, no, I have this other thing that I want to do instead. And so it kind of lets us override that. So do either of you guys have an idea for a convention that a
Yeah.
monster would write inside an
Well,
application?
yeah, I think I can come up with one. So we often end controllers with the word controller. In fact, that's the convention. So you'd have like a user controller.
Right, home
As,
controller, account controller, yeah.
yeah, but I don't think monsters are really into controllers so much as
But
they
being
are.
controlled.
Yeah, well, I think they're more into like daemon overlord. So you'd have like a user daemon overlord and a login daemon overlord, account daemon overlord, that sort of thing. So that would probably be
Right.
something that monsters would have as a convention.
Yeah, and I mean different monsters might have, it's different conventions for different monsters. So some of them might have like Dark Overlord or there's all kinds of ways this could go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many options. We should spin up like a monsters convention framework that just completely changes the way
Uses
it looks.
uses Roslyn for the language. Like we change like instead of throwing an exception, you could like roar.
I was just thinking we'd call it Monster View Controller.
Yeah, I mean
Yes.
we've talked about this in the past about using Roslyn to override certain things. We were talking about changing exception from exception to a sorry, so it was like a
Right.
Canadian version of the language.
Right. Yes. Instead of return, it would be like a.
Yeah. One of these
Okay,
days.
perfect. Yanni, thanks for the question. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter. Send us a message. We'll follow you back. Send us a message, and we will make sure that we get your contact information and mail you out some of these wonderful monster stickers, also known as computer accelerators. These are the modern day turbo switch for your PC.
It's like a Type S view PC. Thanks everybody for joining us on another episode of the ASP.NET Monsters, and we'll see everybody next time.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.